Asian Americans Advancing. Thank you. With Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, GLSEN, NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, National Black Justice Coalition, National Women's Law Center, the Education Trust, and the Intercultural Development Research Association. My name is Hillary Medina. I am an educational field manager here at the Leadership Conference Education Fund, and my pronouns are she, hers. Next slide, please. First, I really want to thank our collaborating organizations for their hard work in creating this event. Additionally, I want to welcome back those of you who have joined us for previous webinars on topics of concern to the civil rights community, and welcome those of you joining for the first time. In just a few minutes, we're going to hear from our speakers who will speak on the importance of establishing inclusive and curricularly responsive curriculum in our schools, culturally responsive curriculum in our schools. But first, I do want to share a little bit about the Leadership Conference Education Fund. Next slide, please. The Leadership Conference Education Fund is the education research arm of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and works to build political will for laws that protect the civil and human rights of all people in this country. This includes protecting the rights of people of color, Native people, women, LGBTQ people, immigrants, people with disabilities, faith communities, working people, children, and all of those at the intersection of those identities. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is a coalition charged by its diverse membership of more than 200 national organizations to promote and protect the civil and human rights of all persons in the United States. Through advocacy and outreach to targeted constituencies, the Leadership Conference works towards the goal of a more open and just society, in America as good as its ideals. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you, Shekinah. Nearly 100 years ago, Carter G. Woodson laid the foundation for Black History Month. Woodson selected this week to build upon the pre-existing celebrations that surrounded President Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass's birthdays. However, Woodson sought to move the celebration from simply the celebration of these two men to the celebration of Black people, for he believed that history was made by the people, not simply or primarily by great men. Woodson hoped that eventually the celebration of Black history would extend throughout the year. It was too large, too important to be crammed into a week or a single month. We are here today because we have not yet achieved this dream. Every student deserves to learn and thrive in a school environment that supports student identities, equips them for the future, and teaches the truth. Unfortunately, across the country, we have seen attempts to gag educators and whitewash the history of the United States by attacking culturally responsive curriculum, respect for LGBTQ students, and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We must teach students the truth of our history to enable them to learn from the mistakes of our past and help create a more just and equitable future. We must ensure that they have an honest and accurate education that helps them develop critical thinking skills. Thankfully, we are not alone in this fight. While there are those who seek to erase history, what they call an attack on critical race theory, there are those who are working to ensure that the stories and experiences of all students are represented in our classrooms. Today, we are going to hear from those actively taking a stand against the attacks on honest teaching, those who are fighting for more inclusive curriculum in their communities, and we're also going to hear what we expect from policymakers in 2022 and how you can get involved. Next slide, please. On this webinar today, we are going to hear from Nick, who is a member of the National Student Council cohort at GLSEN. We are also going to hear from Hamida Labid, Policy Counsel at NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund Incorporated. Next slide, please. And we are also going to hear from Grace Pye, the Executive Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. Then we are going to hear from Letitia Vaughn and Anjani Davis. Letitia comes from the E3 Foundation, and Anjani comes from the Low Country Black Parents Association. And last but certainly not least, we will hear from Melanie William-Jaggers, the Executive Director at GLSEN. We're going to close with question and answer. So please do utilize the question and answer box throughout the chat or throughout your webinar experience. And last, please note that this webinar will be recorded and slides and the recording will be shared with all participants following the event. With that, I'm going to pass it to Nick, our first speaker. Nick, go ahead and take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nick O'Kay, and I'm a 17-year-old senior from Maryland and a member of the National Student Council cohort at the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, otherwise known as GLSEN. And I'm very glad to be speaking with you all today. As predominantly middle-class area characterized by low crime, highly rated schools, and quality healthcare, many residents in my county live sheltered lives. This dynamic is reflected in the county's language arts curriculum, through which students are not exposed to a full array of perspectives of marginalized groups in society. From pre-K to 12th grade, students are required to read works primarily written by white authors that revolve around white characters. Recognizing this lack of curriculum diversity and the inability of many students to engage with people from differing backgrounds, I decided to go beyond my school district and independently start my own organization, the Untold Stories Book Club. Founded 3 years ago, the Untold Stories Book Club provides a virtual space where students from across Maryland can read and discuss literary works involving communities that are often overlooked by mainstream curriculum. Next slide, please. As president of the club, next slide. Thank you. As president of the club, I plan monthly meetings, select reading materials, and create advertisements. Through my role, I lead club members through a variety of opportunities, including celebrations that are culturally appropriate to the works we read, and meetings where aspiring writers can share their work with the club and get support and feedback. In just 3 years, the club has already made a positive impact in my community, exposing students to a variety of perspectives that they would not have learned otherwise. It is as a result of my experiences, both as somebody who was able to bring inclusive education to my community and as a Black LGBTQ+ student who is directly affected by the issues around which I promote such education, that I am particularly disturbed by the constant trend of people trying to make my education and the education of those like me a political playground. Next slide. A brief browsing of social media or news articles nowadays may make it easy for one to think that critical race theory is a complex or new idea at the center of our nation's present culture war. However, critical race theory, created 4 decades ago by legal scholars, is an academic lens of analysis for examining how racism is ingrained in our society's laws and institutions. Over the past few months, however, critical race theory has been dishonestly morphed into a catch-all term used to characterize any educational discussions relating to social justice within American schools and workplaces. The disinformation campaign is not just composed of abstract arguments, but is instead associated with the rapid passage of real recent legislation across various states and municipalities across the country, as well as verbal attacks and vicious threats of violence against school board members and administrators, and disturbing book bans. Next slide, please. Today's anti-CRT movement may seem unprecedented, but it is in reality yet another moment of the broader history of attempts by American society to silence the voices of marginalized communities in America, particularly those of Black and Indigenous people. CRT is a decades-old legal framework that was first developed by legal scholars in the 1970s and 80s following the Civil Rights Movement. It is essentially an academic response to the erroneous notion that American society and institutions are race neutral just because our nation's laws, at least for the most part, no longer explicitly name racial groups or permit discrimination in their text. This scholarly lens holds that racism goes far beyond just individual or interpersonal acts of prejudice or bias, and that it is in fact a systemic phenomenon integrated into the laws and institutions of this nation. A simple review of history affirms this theory. Ironically, educational institutions, the present subjects of the anti-CRT movement, have traditionally been the site of some of this nation's most heinous acts of state-sponsored racism. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, 2022 has proven the very need for the application of critical race theory that it claims, of the very critical race theory that it claims to suppress. The ongoing fight against systemic racism is facing a determined response. According to Education Week, more than 25 states have introduced legislation that could restrict or ban what students can learn and what teachers can teach about our nation's history. Most of these states comprise the regions of America with the highest Black populations. In Tennessee, one group has sought to eliminate the book of Ruby Bridges from Williamson County Schools K-12 curriculum. Written by now 67-year-old Bridges, next slide, please. Written by the famous Ruby Bridges, the group argued that the book shouldn't be used in classrooms because the factual recounting of what Bridges went through is claimed to demonize the white people who targeted her. The same is true of the state of Mississippi, in which civil rights education being integrated into curriculum has been struck down by recent legislation. Similar trends exist within Texas, where teachers have been given disturbing guidance that they must present students with opposing perspectives on the Holocaust, an event which, as it appears to many of us be reminded, was in fact about race. Next slide, please. Overall, honest and accurate discussions about this country's history, including shared knowledge about the legacies of systemic racism, and the political fear-mongering that has been used to maintain it, are necessary to build a more informed society and a multiracial democracy. Yet the realization of this democracy is exactly what the war against CRT is disrupting. If my county is any example, the censorship of truth and access to knowledge of different groups is a prerequisite for eliminating the ability of people to have a voice in their own nation and to promote the continual healing and reconstruction of this country from its past transgressions. I want to conclude with this. The threats to our society presented by the attack against CRT are real, but they are not unprecedented and not incapable of overcoming. In my community, I took a stand for my right to a diverse, equitable, and inclusive education. And it is imperative that we who wish to live in a multiracial society and construct a sustainable future for ourselves and others continue to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for orienting us in the why we are here today. I'm going to pass it, move it right along. Hamida, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hamida Labi, Policy Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I'm excited to be here with you today, and let's briefly discuss how critical race theory is defined and other ways that the anti-truth measures that we'll discuss today attack inclusive teaching. Next slide. And again, thank you. So defining critical race theory. Critical race theory, or often referred to as CRT, is an academic and legal framework that denotes that systemic racism is part of American society. It was first developed by legal scholars in the 1970s and 80s following the civil rights movement, in part as a response to the notion that society and institutions were colorblind. It establishes that racism was not and has never been eradicated in our country and is still woven into the fabric of its existence. Critical race theory recognizes that racism is more than the result of individual bias and prejudice. It is embedded in laws, policies, and institutions that uphold and reproduce racial inequalities. According to critical race theory, societal issues that many of you work on, such as the school to prison pipeline, increasingly segregated schools and housing, the racial achievement gap, outsized exposure to police violence in schools and in communities, are not unrelated anomalies. Next slide. The term critical race theory, as Nick mentioned, has been co-opted by opponents as a catch-all and rallying cry to silence any discussions about systemic racism and sexism, banning the truthful teaching of American history, and reversing progress towards racial justice and equity. One way that we see these anti-truth measures as over-inclusive is by looking at who may be impacted. Proponents often focus on K-12 students and arguing that these topics are not age appropriate and should be left for parents to teach their child. But the text of the bills go a lot further in demonstrating that this is a much broader effort to limit discussions of race and sex and other aspects of American society. They include businesses, nonprofit organizations, entities that receive any state funding, contractors and subcontractors with the government, and as well as including public and private institutions of higher education. Another way that these bills are overly broad is in how they define what material is banned. Some bills specifically name critical race theories while others do not. In some bills that do not specifically mention critical race theory, they refer to things such as divisive concepts and then include a very long list of things that they consider to be a divisive concept. And there aren't a uniform way that states are approaching it. This can look different depending on what state legislation you're reviewing. There are references to teachings or trainings related to implicit or unconscious bias that they're trying to use as defined as critical race theory. Claims, views, or opinions that are expressed and included in the 1619 project, and concepts that make an individual feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. Some bills broadly define critical race theory to include all diversity and inclusion efforts, race-conscious policies, and any education about racism, whether or not they draw from critical race theory or not. So let's get into some specific examples of anti-CRT and anti-truth language. Next slide. This text comes from South Carolina's House Bill 4325, which does specifically name critical race theory. We're using this as an example, but this language that you see here is something that we have seen repeated in many other anti-truth proposals in other states. So this bill does target critical race theory in name, but includes an inaccurate definition of it. It is vaguely worded in a way that most people would say, we agree with this. Why would an educator compel a student of a particular race to believe that they are indeed superior because of that race? There are concerns that this could be understood, on the other hand, to say that educators cannot teach about things like white supremacy. Could this language potentially chill an educator's ability to accurately discuss the role of the Ku Klux Klan in American history? And what about the genocide of Native Americans? Teachers have been trained to discuss difficult topics in a manner to force any student to adopt a certain ideology, but to present these historical facts and then allow their students to use their critical thinking skills and their own experiences to help them understand issues related to race, sex, religion, and more. These are things that they indeed encounter in their daily lives. These measures are not truly about critical race theory. This is about policymakers dictating what and how American history and current events are taught and preserving their own idea of what America is based on their perspective. Next slide. So let's look at another example and zero in on one particular issue that comes up in a lot of different proposals. Here you can see 3 different examples of how anti-truth legislation describes the way that slavery should be taught. It seeks to sever present-day systemic racial inequality from hundreds of years of the enslavement of Black Americans and the systems of oppression that followed it. They want students to learn that liberty and equality are founding principles of the United States, while erasing the historical truth that several founding fathers were indeed enslavers. The subjugation of a people based on race was essential to America's founding. And millions of Americans have endured various forms of state-sponsored discrimination. The long history of and ongoing ways that American government denies freedom and equal rights to Black Americans and others must not be erased from school curricula. Next slide. So we're again going to use an example out of South Carolina, but again, these are things that you will see in other bills. And we think, that this might be of particular interest to many of you on this call because of the type of work that many of your organizations and you as individuals and community advocates do. Some bills go so far, again, this is an example of one that does not specifically name critical race theory, but they go as far as to say that equity must not supplant or replace the idea of equality. So if we adopt, this sort of language in policy, how will school districts identify and remedy disparities without an analysis of its roots and the ability to develop and fund initiatives to eliminate these disparities? Next slide. Another example of a piece of legislation, House Bill 4605. And here we're going to look at how intersectionality is showing up in these anti-truth measures. We have seen proposals that attack teaching, training, and programming related to an individual's race, sex, national origin, religion, and political belief. Again, these measures are far broader than what the true definition of critical race theory examines. In some cases, they specifically ban mandatory gender and sexuality diversity trainings or counseling, or requiring any professional development or courses related to race and gender. This legislation targets the LGBTQ community and includes language that may hinder efforts of schools and others to create safe, healthy, and inclusive school and work environments for all. Next slide. The dangers of the passage of these anti-truth measures are clear. It denies the history and current experiences of Black people and other marginalized communities. And the censorship of these issues may lead to inaccurate instruction, therefore denying students equitable access to a high-quality education. It also threatens the ability of educators and others to advance culturally responsive teaching, which is a research-based approach to teaching that integrates students' cultures, languages, and life experiences with their classroom instruction. These connections help students access rigorous curricula and develop high-level academic skills. And research has shown that this type of teaching improves academic achievement and life outcomes. These anti-truth measures are harmful to kids and communities as a whole. And we look forward to hearing the rest of the discussion today from the advocates that are on the ground working to defeat these measures and some of those that have successfully pushed back. So thank you, and I will return back to Hillary.
Thank you so much, Hamida. Our next speaker is Grace Pai, the Executive Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Chicago. Grace, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share a victory story from Illinois, where we recently passed a new bill requiring Asian American history to be taught in all public schools. Next slide, please. So we passed a history-making requirement in Illinois. We called our bill the TEACH Act, which stands for Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History. And it amends our school code to require all public schools to teach a unit of Asian American history, which will elevate crucial stories and lessons that are often left out. You know, as the previous presenters have shared, we see history often taught in a very one-sided way that does not account for the many different cultures and communities within the US and their contributions. Our bill was significant in that it is the first bill in the country. Makes Illinois the first state in the country to require Asian American history as part of a graduation requirement. So we're really excited that this happened in the Midwest and that it happened in a bipartisan way. So you can see on the slide that we passed this bill with huge bipartisan margins, despite having a Democratic trifecta and veto-proof Democratic majorities in Illinois. So we, did not necessarily approach, or we did not necessarily have the expectation that we would have so much bipartisan support. And so we were really pleasantly surprised to see how many Republicans did support the bill and vote for it when it came to the floor. We had not a single opposition vote in our Senate. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just very briefly share kind of an advocacy timeline to give you a sense of how we got it done and what it took. So we launched this effort in February of 2020 when we started to draft bill language and started to talk to coalition partners. We first approached our Pan-Asian Voter Empowerment Coalition, the PAVE Coalition, which is a group of Asian American serving organizations that have collaborated on state legislative work and different advocacy, including things like census outreach, for more than 10 years. We've been doing collective work for about a decade. And so we had that sort of just foundation to start from, and we had those strong partnerships, and the PAVE Coalition was the first coalition that we went to. That group approved our bill language, and we asked folks who wants to really, zero in on passing this bill, and we formed a steering committee specifically for this piece of legislation. At that point in the spring, we also started to see the pandemic shutdown, right? March 2020, it feels like ages and ages ago, but that was when our first stay-at-home orders came into play, and the state legislature kind of effectively shut down in Illinois, as I'm sure it did in many other parts of the country. And so we kind of knew at that point that it was probably unlikely that we were going to be able to move the bill in 2020 as we had originally planned. But we still approached our Senate sponsor, State Senator Ram Villavalam, who's the only South Asian state legislator in Illinois, and asked him if he would champion the bill. He did introduce it in May of 2020, but just kind of for symbolic reasons, just to get it out there in public conversation, knowing that we wouldn't be able to move it forward until the following legislative session. So we, approached a House sponsor over the summer, got the bills reintroduced in January of 2021, and our legislative session is about half a year. It goes from January through May. And so we, went through that kind of 6-month process of doing legislative outreach and getting the bill passed through the appropriate committees and ultimately on the floor. You'll notice that I noted here in March 2021, we saw the really tragic Atlanta spa shootings, and that certainly helped contribute momentum and really make the case for why this bill about Asian American history was so critically important amid rising anti-Asian sentiment related to the pandemic and those extreme acts of violence that we saw impacting our community. We celebrated passage in May, and the bill was signed into law in July of 2021. Next slide, please. So I want to kind of give you all a little bit of a sense of how we passed the bill and what role did Advancing Justice and our coalition partners play in making this a success. So we did lots and lots of legislative outreach. Like with any state legislative or bill effort, we had to contact as many legislators as we could. We found it particularly challenging to do virtual outreach, in part because, while doing virtual outreach and, meeting with folks on Zoom is great and more accessible in some ways, it was also more inaccessible in other ways because a lot of legislators had very tight schedules. And instead of being able to talk to a legislator in the hall in the state capitol for 10 or 15 minutes, we had to set up a 45-minute or an hour-long meeting. And those turned out to be very challenging to just get on people's calendars. We also had strong relationships with our bill sponsors who we had worked with in the past on different efforts. And so they definitely championed the bill and, were working the roll call, reaching out to their colleagues, working with them closely. We also did a lot of narrative building through earned media and social media. I'll share some of those highlights in a little bit, but we wanted to really make a case for why this was important and why it is important now, right? We definitely kind of talked a lot about the rising anti-Asian sentiment and education as a way that we can get at the root causes of anti-Asian violence and racism and just discrimination in general. In the wake of a lot of the kind of increase in violence that we've seen a lot of members of our community kind of turn to law enforcement as a solution. And for Advancing Justice Chicago, that's not something that we support because of the negative impact on other communities of color. And so we really use this Teach Act legislation as a way to really point to the root causes and say, what do we think will actually prevent anti-Asian violence or discrimination or harassment from occurring in the future, and starting with educating our kids about the contributions of Asian Americans, that Asian Americans are part of American history, that was a really important place to start. We also did a lot of community education and mobilization. You can see some of the graphics that we created for community education workshops that we did, and how we were able to kind of bring people in who might not have otherwise been involved or to deepen people's involvement. And so we worked with a lot of volunteer leaders throughout this process. And those volunteer leaders helped us recruit a diverse list of endorsing organizations who we were able to ask to step up and support when we needed some, extra juice to get to the finish line. Next slide, please. So this is just a kind of snapshot of some of the media coverage that we got throughout the campaign. We worked with youth leaders. We had a bunch of high school youth from various schools who were involved, and we worked to place op-eds written directly from the perspective of youth who would be impacted by this legislation to get those op-eds published. We had high school leaders testifying in front of the education committees and really working with their peers to build more momentum and to make sure that folks were aware of an effort like this and could step into leadership roles to help us pass the bill. We got a lot of earned media coverage also related to anti-Asian hate. And so, we were able to kind of pivot some of that attention into this very concrete solution. Next slide, please. So our impact, just to quantify some of the impact that we had more than 20 leaders who were volunteers who took on significant leadership and campaign responsibilities. So while we had a lot of paid staff who were involved in coordinating and making all of this happen, we made it a point to work with volunteer leaders and to really develop their leadership so that we can build a stronger base to be able to take on bigger fights in the future. We collected 65 personal testimonies from community members who shared why the Teach Act is important to them. And we illustrated some of those testimonies, an example of which you can see on the slide here, which was a story of someone who grew up in a refugee family talking about the trauma that her family experienced and what it would have meant to her to learn about Asian American history and refugee communities in the US as part of her education. We sent over 15,000 text messages to Illinois voters, both telling them about this effort and asking them to contact their legislators. And we mobilized more than 800 emails directly from constituents to their legislators, which is something that we know is really impactful, particularly at the state legislative level. And we also got over 1,000 witness slips in support of the bill in advance of key committee votes. And that's kind of a, just a piece of Illinois' legislative process that people have the opportunity to submit a witness slip indicating whether they are a proponent or opponent of a bill. And so we got, over 1,000 witness slips to demonstrate the widespread support for a bill like this. Next slide, please. So just to share a little bit about what we're thinking in terms of implementation, passing the bill was a huge first step, but we also need to make sure that we are supporting teachers who are, having a uniquely difficult and challenging time right now, like both with, just teaching during a pandemic, all of the uncertainty around remote learning, around in-person learning, around mask mandates and COVID protections, right? And so we want to make it as easy as possible for teachers to incorporate Asian American history into the lesson plans that they already have and that they already teach. So we will be providing free professional development workshops for teachers and compiling quality curricular resources so that teachers kind of have a one-stop shop. They know where to go to find lesson plans, book lists, primary sources, short videos online, documentaries, all of that, because there are so many wonderful resources out there that are available for free. We're also partnering with stakeholders, including universities, teachers unions, elected officials, and the Illinois State Board of Education to make sure that we can get in front of as many teachers as possible and collaborate to really make sure that we are equipping schools to have the resources that they need to teach Asian American history and to teach it well. And finally, we're continuing to engage youth through a Teach Youth Council, which is a leadership opportunity for high school youth anywhere in Illinois to help us really create that accountability mechanism and make sure that they are telling us, are they learning Asian American history in schools or not? What are their schools' plans to teach Asian American history, to offer professional development for their teachers? And so we're working to engage both students and parents and community members alike to keep up the momentum. And I'm just excited to share, this is my final slide, but just wanted to highlight that since Illinois passed this bill in May of last year and signed into law in July, New Jersey has also passed a similar piece of legislation just, I think, a few weeks ago. And so we are already seeing momentum around the country to ensure that Asian American history is included as, there is this kind of movement to rethink what history we're teaching and how to make sure that all of the history that we're teaching is inclusive and reflective of, the honest history of the United States. So I will close there and pass it back to Hillary.
Thank you so much, Grace. I am next. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it to some wonderful folks who are working in South Carolina. Letitia, you're up first. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here this afternoon with some fabulous people. I am learning a lot and just am here to share some of the work that's happening here in South Carolina. So my name is Letitia Vaughn, and I am one of the co-founders of the E3 Foundation. And my partner in crime, Anjanae Davis, will join me in just a minute. I'm here to talk about the work from the perspective of an organization that we would consider a convening organization. And Anjanae will talk from the perspective of some on the ground work that is happening. So you can move forward. Thank you. Next slide. And so back one, sorry. Thank you. And so this slide really exemplifies the E3 Foundation's approach to all of the work we do. We believe that education is the process by which a community builds its capacity to solve its own problems and co-create its future. You can go to the next slide. And just real quickly before I dive in, I just want to give you a little bit of background about E3. So we are an organization whose mission is to ensure that those who are most impacted by inequities are educated, empowered, and elevated to exercise their collective agency in the South. And we do that through three, what we call strands or tenets. We educate, we empower, and elevate. And so from the education perspective, we are focused on ensuring Black and Brown families are educated through a culturally competent, relevant, and sustaining environment. We believe in the building of coalition of Black and Brown leaders, educators, Black-led organizations, Black and Brown children and families for the purpose of empowering so that all of our families in the community can act in their power and their purpose. You can go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, not next slide. And so for us, our work started in South Carolina way before the CRT work, but the alarm was sounded for us last summer when our state superintendent made a public statement about CRT and the teaching of history, racism. And so we decided that we wanted to convene the community around a conversation about how we respond to that statement. What you've heard, and I'm really excited that Hamida is also on this call because Hamida is one of our coalition partners. And so we know that the accuracy and the way that history is reflected and taught in our community is extremely important, not only to the Black and Brown community, but to all of us. And so, Grace, I'm also excited to learn about the legislation that was passed through you guys' efforts. And so at that time, we knew because there was no public response collectively from our community that we had to bring people together to respond. And so that really began the work of building coalition around the anti-truth legislative focus that has been happening in South Carolina. Fast forward, our board chair connected us with some pretty significant partners, and we've begun to build a growing coalition across the state. And so right now we have a partnership with the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Low Country Black Parents Association, and we have a coordinating committee of over 30 folks that meet once a week with subcommittees. And so our subcommittees were driven by policy, by community engagement, by communication, and we're using those subcommittees to further advance the work that we're doing. And so with our coalition, we've been able to build a partnership not only with our local partners, but they are regional, meaning in the Charleston area, we have Tri-County. So we have a Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester counties that feed into kind of one common area. So we would call it a regional partnership. We also have partners across the state. And so many folks in our coalition span from Columbia, which is about 2 hours away, Myrtle Beach, Greenville, Florence. And so because we have such a close partnership with the coordinating partners that that I outlined previously, the communication goes out to our larger group and our broader coalition, which is now over 100 members, which we meet monthly in order to, again, further advance the work. So in South Carolina, there are 5 bills in the House and 1 bill in the Senate. And through the organizing, we've been able to further several actions, one being just letter writing campaign. And so if you go to the NAACP Legal Defense Funds, there's a landing page, which we're in the process of reformatting, but there are several tools, including how to write letters to legislators. We also have had a social media blitz in which the social media was shared multiple times, and we were tagging our legislators. We have a campaign to do letter writing to our legislators directly, and we have a campaign which involves in-person testimony, which will be next week. And so we'll be excited to report back on the outcomes of those actions. We also have a letter sign-on, which involves business and educators signing on to a letter in support of pro-truth and the way history is taught in South Carolina. And so I would just say that I'm really, really very excited about the way our work is shaping up and the coalitions and partnership and allies that we've built over the last year, knowing that it is a work in progress, knowing that we're all learning. But now I want to turn it over to AJ Davis, who's going to talk more about some work that is happening on the ground. And as I said, E3 is a convening organization, and our goal is to partner with community-based organizations like Low Country Black Parents Association that are working directly with children and families in order to make the information accessible and digestible. So AJ, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Letitia. I appreciate that. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present to you guys today. I do not have any slides due to the fact that a lot of the work that we are doing is ongoing. I think Letitia summed up the mission and philosophy that we have. But my name is AJ Davis, Anjanae Davis, and I am one of the co-founders of an organization here in the Charleston Low Country called Low Country Black Parents Association. We came about at the beginning of the pandemic in response to what we saw as the need for advocacy for Black parents in regards to education and educational supports. That mission morphed pretty much in 2021 with the rise of what we saw in the anti-CRT rhetoric, anti-truth rhetoric that was taking the nation by storm. And as Letitia stated, in June of last year, our state superintendent of education, Molly Spearman, penned a very incendiary social media post that was pretty much unsolicited, but it signaled to us that the wave of anti-truth and anti-CRT rhetoric that we saw in other parts of the country was making its way and had made its way to South Carolina. The purpose of our group is a very grassroots initiative to empower and engage Black parents and guardians in advocacy for their students and their children in the public and private educational systems. But however, we also work in conjunction with partner organizations such as E3, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, South Carolina ACLU, and any other organizations that are pushing forward authentic and culturally responsive teaching, curriculum, and initiatives in our public and private schools. And so one of the things that we recognized early on is that we had a year-long, well, other groups had a year-long head start um, that, in my opinion, showed the level of organizing that had been done and had been taking place with regards to the anti-CRT movement here in America. And so with Low Country Black Parents, what we do is we make sure that we help to decipher information and the rhetoric that is currently being pushed out in a way that parents and the community can understand. And it is a job, I will tell anybody that's watching or listening, misinformation is a very real thing, is a tremendous drain on society. Those of us who are in the field doing this work, especially those of us at the grassroots level, one of the biggest things that we encounter is helping people to see why a lot of the things that they're reading and that they're seeing regarding not just anti-CRT, but culturally responsive curriculum, social emotional learning, all of that, those things that are being put out by uh, right-wing and right-leaning groups and whatnot, those things tend to have a slant to them that make it confusing for the general public who may not be as well aware. But thankfully, being a part of the coalition that E3 has founded here in our state has allowed us to be able to be equipped with the tools and the resources to be able to go into communities, to go into social groups, to go into organizations and networks and help those groups and individuals understand exactly what's happening and why it's happening. Also putting us in line to be able to talk with policy and decision makers, which is pretty much unprecedented in a state like ours, especially for Black parents and Black communities. And so because of this, we are grateful, we are excited, and we are hungry to continue the pushback that we have put forward, not only against the anti-CRT rhetoric, but the onslaught of groups that have proliferated here in our state that are pushing these very skewed and divisive narratives as to what is actually being taught in our public schools. Another thing that our organization has also filled the gap in is the fact that many of the teachers who are targeted by this legislation are also parents. And so we wanted to make sure that they had a voice in what was going on and were protected from any type of retribution and things of that nature. And so we are, again, an organization that is very much so grassroots, but I think that the combination of our efforts alongside the convening of the E3 Foundation, as well as the statewide coalition that we have, will allow us to be able to make sure that while this legislation seems to be daunting, seems to be overwhelming, we will be able to push back for our legislators, especially in this year being a election year, which is very pivotal when it comes down to how we can slow down or even eradicate some of this push. So I thank you all for your time, attention, and for this opportunity, and I pass it back over to Hillary.
Thank you so much, Anjanae and Letitia. I am next going to pass it to our closing speaker, Melanie Willingham-Jaggers, the Executive Director at GLSEN.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to my colleagues on the panel. My name is Melanie Willingham-Jaggers. My pronouns are they and she, and I'm proud to have been recently appointed as GLSEN's new Executive Director. GLSEN is a national organization that was founded over 30 years ago by educators. Next slide, please. Through our experience working with communities and over 20 years of research, we've learned that when a school is safer and more inclusive for a Black trans girl, it is safer and more inclusive for all young people. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today and echo what many have already said on this call. We have to oppose the erasure of LGBTQ+ people, BIPOC folks, people with disabilities, and other people who are from communities that experience marginalization in classrooms across the country and in society at large. We're doing all we can to support young people during this time of mass disruption and trauma, and to move in a direction of positive affirmation and ultimately liberation. Next slide. We are all here because we care about young people. We want them to thrive and reach their full potential, and at a minimum, to have access, to have equal access to opportunity and safety. Through our research, we've surfaced 4 core supports. They are as follows, and these 4 supports are key to student success. Comprehensive policies that prohibit victimization, supportive educators, access to peer networks like GSAs, supportive peer networks, and what we're here to talk about today, access to inclusive curriculum. There's a lot to say here. What I want to ground us in is why it's essential that all young people see themselves fully reflected in the classroom. Next slide, please. Access to inclusive curriculum has profound and long-term benefits for students. Curriculum serves as a mirror when it reflects individuals and their experiences back to themselves. At the same time, curriculum serves as a window when it introduces and provides the opportunity to understand the experiences and perspectives of those with different identities. Positive visibility and affirmation for students who are LGBTQ+, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and people with disabilities is critical because it supports and grows students' ability to empathize, connect, and collaborate with diverse peers. This is essential to achieving positive school transformation in education systems across the country, yes. And these are skills that are foundational to a healthy and robust multiracial democracy. I've included some top lines here from our 2019 National School Climate Survey. What we know from our research is that where there is inclusive curriculum, there's less bias-based language and victimization reported in schools. The school climate is safer and more inclusive. When students feel safer, they're more able to learn, and our young people report higher self-esteem, lower depression, higher GPAs, and a greater likelihood of having made plans to pursue post-secondary education. The bottom line here, it's a good thing for learners and learning communities. Next slide, please. Despite these myriad benefits, inclusive curriculum is currently not taught in schools across the country. Only 1/3 of students in our most recent National School Climate Survey reported being taught any LGBTQ+ related content in schools. And of those students, less than half said that those representations were exclusively positive. Furthermore, only 1/5 of students who received any sex education reported that it included LGBTQ+ specific content. And less than 1/10 said that those representations were positive and affirming of LGBTQ+ identities. Too often, students are exposed to denigrating content. 14% experience exclusively negative, and 3% experience a mix of positive and negative. Next slide, please. In light of these statistics, there is much work to be done to safeguard and care for youth from all communities that experience marginalization. GLSEN has resources for educators and youth organizers on the ground. For example, we have LGBTQ+ inclusive curriculum guides and professional development and training for educators. Our Rainbow Library program lifts up affirming and appropriate content, such as books on LGBTQ+ communities for students to be able to check out at their local libraries. The Rainbow Library offers LGBTQ+ affirming K-12 books and resources free of charge to schools who reach out with a request. When a school requests books, signage, and other resources, they're also able to tap into our programs and services for educators and youth. Having started in just one state in 2019, the program now serves over 1,800 schools and libraries in 19 states. These awful bills that are being sponsored by politicians making cynical arguments about what education should accomplish are again telling youth who they can and cannot be, and trying to erase communities that these children are part of and that we all agree should be welcome. Next slide, please. We need inclusive curricular standards in every state that empowers districts and schools to develop curriculum that is fully representative of communities. Enumerating curricular standards must include positive visibility for LGBTQ+ folks, for women, for people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people with disabilities, and all who sit at the intersection of marginalized identities. GLSEN has been in the fight to overturn exclusionary curriculum since the so-called promo-homo laws of the 1990s. And we continue to fight today by passing inclusive curricular standards legislation that can be implemented by districts and schools that develop inclusive curriculum. A highlight of our work in 2021 was our close partnership with local advocates to pass inclusive curricular standards in Nevada and model inclusive curriculum in Connecticut. This map shows that the states that have enacted positive and negative curriculum laws by the end of last year's state legislative cycle. The 7 states in green have enacted curricular standards that are affirming and inclusive of LGBTQ+ and other marginalized identities. The 4 states in light blue currently have no promo homo laws that ban positive discussion of LGBTQ+ issues. And the 10 states in dark blue have adopted discriminatory bans on teaching the truth about race in school. My greatest hope is that we can all get information and work together to advance our collective vision of inclusive and culturally responsive education that promotes the well-being of all students. Next slide, please. We are experiencing a despicable wave of exclusionary curriculum bills this year. I've been speaking out in the media recently about the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And just last week, a GLSEN educator in Florida was greeted at their classroom door by their school principal, who was there to tell them which pieces of affirming signage needed to be removed from their classroom to, quote, keep them from getting in trouble. The bill hasn't even passed yet, and this is just one story of many. The chilling effect on educators and the erasure of support for young people has already begun. We will continue to work with our local chapters, Equality Florida, and others across the country and invite you to do the same. We must be visible and vocal in our support of children whose communities and families and selves are being targeted. So far, more than 70 exclusionary curriculum bans have been introduced, and want to keep educators from telling the truth about race in schools. There has also been a growing trend of bills that seek to allow parents to opt their children out of inclusive curriculum, and that benefits all people. And we expect more of the same. A more recent wave of curriculum bans focus on gender and target LGBTQ+ communities in particular. We must do everything we can to defeat these regressive policies and advance our vision of culturally responsive and inclusive curriculum, to move the map in a direction that is better for schools and communities. Last year, we worked directly with advocates in Nevada and Connecticut to pass inclusive curricular standards legislation. And so far this year, at least 20 bills have been introduced that would establish affirming curricular standards. We applaud our partners and the community leaders in Massachusetts and elsewhere who are championing these bills and are happy to connect on efforts to get them passed. Next slide, please. Let's all get in the fight and mobilize to defeat these terrible bills and pass affirming legislation wherever we can. We have to advance our vision of positive and affirming school transformation. And when we talk about curriculum, we should always be lifting up the positive visibility of all communities that experience marginalization across all areas of study, right? That's civics, history, ethnic studies, math, science, sex education. We encourage you to connect with your state or local GLSEN chapter and our national staff to connect on how we can support each other's work. We want you to speak out and show up with us, and we want to do the same. Everyone here understands that these legislative battles are only the beginning and that the end of this journey is nowhere in sight. If you're working in a state that does have inclusive curricular standards, start a conversation with your state education agency on how to support districts on implementation. We can look by way of example to the work that's being done by the Oregon Department of Education. They're offering resources and technical assistance to local education agencies implementing inclusive curricular standards. We have a webinar available to you where I had a chance to speak with Oregon's Chief State School Officer, Colt Gill, about how they're working to support local efforts. The team here also put together some ideas about how the state and local education agencies can leverage federal emergency relief funding to help fund review and development of inclusive curriculum. Next slide, please. So I want to end by saying thank you to everyone in this room, virtual room, for being in community and discussion on how we can work together and increase our impact. Please know that I and everyone at GLSEN are a resource and that we look forward to discovering more synergies on collaboration. Here are a few resources, and I'm happy to talk more during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, so much. And thank you again to all of our speakers. I know that we are running a little over time, so I'm going to move quickly through our final moments and then hopefully take a few questions. Next slide, please. So first, there were a lot of resources shared on this call. We are going to share this recording, share some resources, share the slide deck in a follow-up email to all registrants. And we really encourage you to take some time next week and dig deeper and learn about the situation in your state. Next slide. And then of course, always gather your people. We know here at the Leadership Conference, the power that comes in working in coalition. And there are a lot of folks around the country. We are not alone here in this fight. Next slide. And then there are a lot of people working on this issue. There is a huge support network. I've listed out the websites of all of our wonderful co-hosts for this event. Additionally, if you would like to stay connected with us at the Leadership Conference and partners to hear about future webinars, important resources, news and updates, and ways to take action, you are welcome to, we will drop it in the chat, the bit.ly link, join our email list, and you will receive updates from us on future webinars. Next slide. And then I want to note, especially because we're running over, that this is our first webinar in a series all about teaching truth. Our upcoming webinars coming up this spring, we will have an entire webinar dedicated to how do we talk about this issue? How do we message this issue? And then we will have a webinar that dives a little deeper on the legislation, both legislation that's promoting inclusive and culturally responsive curriculum, as well as how do we take action to organize against legislation that's looking to suppress truth. Next slide. And that brings us to question and answers. So I've noticed there are a few question and answers in the question box. Please do, if you have a question, submit it to the question and answer. We are running a little over time. We might not be able to get to all of our questions, but I do want to note that this is the first series in a webinar. This is the first webinar in a series of webinars, so we will be able to answer questions at a later date. Additionally, we're going to try to connect with some of our speakers and see if we can type up some answers and get those out to folks. But the first question we have from our question box, Grace, how are you able to get such strong bipartisan support for the TEACH Act? And what advice do you have for others having a hard time getting Republican support for these efforts? I assume that some of the supporters of this bill do not support on other policies that are important to the AAPI community. So have you thought about the dynamic in your advocacy?
I'll be really honest that we did not really proactively have a strategy to win bipartisan support or to appeal to Republicans in particular. There are a number of issues, of course, that we have supported that we have not been able to win Republican support on, and so it wasn't a huge part of our legislative strategy. So in that sense, it was a little bit of a surprise, but I can explain why I think that the margins happened in the way that they did. I think the rise in anti-Asian racism and the accompanying press coverage, and especially the Atlanta shooting and the aftermath, created a very different political climate within which to pass a bill related to Asian American history. There were, generally, I would say we have gotten feedback and heard in debate, on other legislative issues that Republicans were not likely to support a curricular mandate and had, opposed different curricular mandates in the past. And so, it was kind of inconsistent with some of the voting records of folks who did vote yes on our bill. But I think this was a time when a lot of elected officials didn't want to be perceived as saying no to an issue that was deeply important to the Asian American community. I will say, I saw another question in the Q&A that kind of asked about whether Republicans might be aiming to kind of tack on to this anti-affirmative action fight that some members of the Asian American community have been involved in. We, as Advancing Justice Chicago and across our national affiliation, are deeply supportive of affirmative action policies and have been really vocal on that. But I think that I imagine that there are, it's not that there are plenty of conservative Asian Americans out there. And I think that base is a base that I imagine Republicans in Illinois had in mind when they were casting that vote as well.
Thank you so much, Grace. Our next question goes to Letitia and AJ from South Carolina. How should parents approach advocacy towards particularly conservative school boards or moderate school boards?
One of the things I would say is to first understand that as parents, you have a right to advocate for your children, no matter whether your school board is conservative, liberal, whatever. The first and foremost thing that you need to do is understand, depending upon your state, all parents should have rights that are written in their legislation. And being able to, one, go to your school boards and request that they adhere to the policies and procedures that they're beholden to by state law is important. I know it can be intimidating, especially in these days and times, but it is ultimately a true responsibility, and have confidence in yourself. And I know that's sometimes easier said than done.
And I think I would agree with AJ, just understanding and knowing your right to advocate on behalf of yourself and your children. And that, as simple as we all have a right to request meetings. We all have a right to write letters on behalf of the issues that we're facing with our school board members and our legislators. One of the first things that we asked our stakeholders to do as we were doing this work is go to the South Carolina State House legislator, find out who your legislators are, and call them, write them with specific issues. And so I would agree with AJ that starting with just bridging that communication, because they are elected officials and they are here to hear from all constituents, regardless of political Democrat or Republican, whether they're Democrat or Republican. And so we should be bridging that communication gap with our legislators, no matter what their political affiliation.
Thank you, Letitia. And then we're going to take one last question, noting that quite a few questions were sent in advance and we might not have been able to get to all of them. This question goes to Melanie. How can teachers provide inclusive and equitable learning opportunities within existing curriculum standards?
It's a great question. Two things here. One, GLSEN, please come to us at GLSEN for support in how to frame these issues. That's one. Part two is I want to be very clear that the whole purpose of so much of this legislation that is reflected on that map that I showed you is precisely about limiting and making impossible, right, that accurate, truthful, positive, and affirming representation of LGBTQ plus and other marginalized communities in school curriculum, right? So I want to be clear that it is not necessarily easy. Please come to us for support and guidance. I'm happy to share more and additional resources with you. But again, wanting to name specifically that the whole purpose of this effort is to make it difficult, impossible, or create liability for individuals that try to create inclusive classrooms.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And Shekinah, if you could go ahead and share our last slide. I want to go ahead and close us out with a very sincere appreciation to all of our speakers. I cannot say enough good words about you all. Words just don't do your amazingness justice, but thank you for joining us. Also, thank you everyone who is on this call for joining us. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to my colleague Shekinah or myself. And then last, of course, please don't forget to join our email list. The link is shared in the chat. I also do want to apologize and note that we were not able to secure closed captioning for this event. We will be sharing a recording as well as the slides, as well as a plethora of resources into your inbox in the near future. And that video recording will have closed captionings on it. And then, of course, please be on the lookout, all of you, for an invitation to our the next webinars in this series, Teaching Truth. This is only the beginning of the discussion. There is so much more to talk about this issue. So we hope to see you again sometime soon. Thank you so much, and everyone have a wonderful day.